In Redemption Creek, justice came swift and merciless, but sometimes mercy arrives in the most unexpected forms. This is the story of how one man's simple act of kindness changed an entire town forever. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin this incredible journey of redemption, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because stories like this remind us that even in our darkest moments, hope can emerge from the most unexpected places. Now let's witness how a single act of mercy transformed an entire community. The winter of 1884 had been merciless to Redemption Creek, Texas. What little grass remained was brown and brittle, crackling underfoot like old bones. The once flowing creek that gave the town its name had dwindled to muddy puddles, and hope seemed as scarce as rain. Ezra Whitman stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping his worn hat. At 52, the farmer had seen his share of hardship, lost crops, a wife taken by consumption, and children who'd moved east seeking better fortunes. His face, lined by years of sun and sorrow, bore the quiet dignity of a man who'd learned to endure. The crowd had gathered in the town square, their faces hard as granite. At the center stood Mayor Hutchins, a portly man whose prosperity had insulated him from the worst of the drought. Beside him, Sheriff Coleman adjusted his gun belt nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings. "String him up!" shouted Jeremiah Bass, the baker whose store had been robbed. "Theft is theft, no matter the age." The object of their fury was a boy, couldn't be more than 12 years old. Tommy O'Brien stood on the wooden crate beneath the hanging tree, his small frame dwarfed by the noose around his neck. His red hair caught the afternoon light, and freckles stood out starkly against his pale, tear-stained cheeks. His clothes were little more than rags, hanging loosely on his malnourished frame. "Please," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the crowd's angry murmur. "I was just hungry. Ma died 3 months back and I ain't eaten proper in days." "Should have thought of that before you stole from honest folk," Bass spat, his face red with indignation. "We are all struggling, boy. That don't give you the right to take what ain't yours." Dr. Margaret Foster, the town's only physician and one of the few women who dared speak in such gatherings, stepped forward. Her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. She looked up at the boy with compassion evident in her eyes. "Gentlemen, surely we can find another way. He's just a child." "A thieving child," interrupted Silas Morton, who owned the general store. "If we let this slide, every desperate soul in the territory will think they can help themselves to our goods. We can't afford mercy in times like these." Ezra watched the proceedings with growing unease. Something about the boy reminded him of his own son, Samuel, who'd been about Tommy's age when he left for California. The same defiant tilt to the chin, the same fierce independence burning in eyes too old for such a young face. "What exactly did he steal?" Ezra called out, his voice cutting through the commotion. Bass turned toward him, surprised. "Ezra Whitman, didn't expect to see you here. The boy took a whole loaf of bread and some cheese, worth maybe 50 cents, but it's the principle of the matter." 50 cents. Ezra's jaw tightened. They were preparing to execute a child over 50 cents worth of food. "And you're certain he took it to sell, not to eat?" Ezra pressed. "Does it matter?" Morton snapped. "Theft is theft." Tommy's voice rose above the crowd, cracking with emotion. "I haven't eaten in 3 days, mister. My belly was hurting something fierce and I saw that bread in the window. I know it was wrong, but I thought maybe, just maybe, God would understand." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He remembered his own children's voices, remembered nights when he'd gone without supper, so they could eat their fill. He remembered Sarah, his beloved wife, reading to them from the good book about feeding the hungry and caring for the least among them. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, folks, maybe we should consider—" "Consider what?" Bass interrupted. "The law is clear. Theft is a hanging offense. We voted on it fair and square when the drought started. Can't start making exceptions now." "The boy's got no family," added Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. "No one to take responsibility for him. He's been living rough since his mother passed. What kind of life is that anyway?" Ezra felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of outrage and determination he hadn't experienced since Sarah's funeral. He stepped forward, pushing through the crowd until he stood directly beneath the hanging tree. "I'll take responsibility for him," he announced, his voice steady and clear. The crowd fell silent. Even Tommy stopped sobbing, looking down at Ezra with wide, disbelieving eyes. What did you say? Mayor Hutchins asked, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. I said I'll take responsibility for the boy. I'll pay for what he stole. 50 cents, you said? And I'll see to it he doesn't steal again. Ezra reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 quarters, the last of his money until the next small harvest. He held the coins up for all to see. Now hold on just a minute, Morton protested. You can't just— Why not? Ezra challenged. The boy was hungry. I'm willing to pay his debt and vouch for his character going forward. Seems like a fair solution to me. Dr. Foster nodded approvingly. It's more than fair, Ezra. It's Christian. Bass snatched the coins from Ezra's outstretched hand. Fine, but if that boy so much as looks sideways at my store again, it's back to the rope. Sheriff Coleman, clearly relieved, moved quickly to remove the noose from Tommy's neck. The boy collapsed to his knees as soon as his feet touched the ground, his whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Ezra knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. What's your name, son? Tommy O'Brien, sir, the boy stammered, looking up at Ezra with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. But why? Why'd you help me? You don't even know me. Ezra helped Tommy to his feet, noting how light the boy felt, how his ribs showed through his torn shirt. Sometimes knowing someone isn't as important as knowing what's right, he said quietly. Besides, looks to me like you could use a hot meal and a place to sleep. The crowd began to disperse, some grumbling about misplaced mercy, others nodding approvingly at Ezra's intervention. As they walked away from the hanging tree, Tommy looked back once, shuddering at how close he'd come to death. Mr. Whitman, Tommy said softly, I promise I won't be no trouble. I can work hard, earn my keep. Ezra smiled for the first time in months. I'm counting on it, Tommy O'Brien, I'm counting on it. As they walked toward Ezra's modest farm on the outskirts of town, neither man nor boy could have imagined the extraordinary events that would unfold by sunrise. Ezra's farmhouse sat like a weathered sentinel against the endless Texas sky, its wooden walls bleached gray by sun and time. The structure was modest, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that served as the heart of the home. Sarah's touches remained everywhere. The blue gingham curtains she'd sewn, the rocking chair where she'd mended clothes and told stories, the small wooden cross hanging above the mantelpiece. Tommy stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple cleanliness of the place. After months of sleeping in abandoned buildings and under bridge trestles, the sight of a real home with swept floors and the lingering scent of yesterday's bread seemed almost magical. Sit yourself down, Ezra instructed gently, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Let me see what I can rustle up for supper. The farmer moved about his kitchen with practiced efficiency, though Tommy could see the cupboards were nearly bare. A few potatoes, some dried beans, a small piece of salt pork, and half a loaf of bread. Not much to sustain 2 people, especially a growing boy who hadn't eaten properly in months. Mr. Whitman, Tommy began hesitantly, I don't want to take food from your mouth. Maybe I should— Nonsense, Ezra interrupted, setting a pot of water to boil on the wood stove. A man's got to eat, and you're nothing but skin and bones. Sarah always said the good Lord had a way of providing when folks looked out for each other. As Ezra prepared their simple meal, Tommy examined his surroundings more closely. A photograph on the mantel caught his attention. A beautiful woman with kind eyes standing beside a younger Ezra, 3 children clustered around them. That's my family, Ezra said, following Tommy's gaze. Sarah, my wife, and our children, Samuel, Mary, and little Elizabeth. Sarah passed 2 years ago come spring. Consumption took her slow. The children, well, they've gone their own ways. Samuel's in California trying to strike it rich. Mary married a banker in Dallas, and Elizabeth lives with her aunt in Houston. Don't you get lonely? Tommy asked softly. Ezra paused in his stirring, considering the question. Lonely's a choice, son. I got my memories, my faith, and work to keep my hands busy. Most days, that's enough. He ladled the thin stew into 2 bowls, setting the larger portion before Tommy. Besides, seems the Lord had plans to fill this house with company again. They ate in comfortable silence, Tommy trying not to wolf down the food despite his desperate hunger. The stew was simple but warm, seasoned with kindness rather than spices. It was the best meal he'd tasted since his mother's death. After supper, Ezra showed Tommy to Samuel's old room. The bed was narrow but comfortable, with clean sheets and a quilt Sarah had made. A small window looked out over the failing crops and the endless prairie beyond. "Tomorrow we'll see about getting you some proper clothes," Ezra said, noting how Tommy's current garments barely held together. "And we'll need to discuss your education. A boy your age should be in school." Tommy's eyes widened. "School? But I can't pay." "Learning ain't about paying, son. It's about preparing yourself for whatever life has in store." Sarah was big on education, said it was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. That night, as Tommy lay in the first real bed he'd known in months, he stared at the ceiling and wondered at the strange turn his life had taken. This morning he'd been a condemned thief. Tonight he was, what? A son? A ward? He wasn't sure. But for the first time since his mother's death, he felt something resembling hope. Meanwhile, Ezra sat in his kitchen, writing in a worn leather journal by lamplight. It had been Sarah's suggestion to keep a record of his thoughts, a practice he'd maintained even after her death. "December 15th, 1884, he wrote. "Today I did something Sarah would have been proud of. Found myself a boy to look after. Tommy O'Brien, an Irish lad whose circumstances reminded me too much of our Lord's own words about caring for the least among us. Don't know what tomorrow will bring, but tonight this old house feels more like a home than it has in 2 years." The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Ezra woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and found Tommy already dressed and standing uncertainly in the kitchen. "Morning, Mr. Whitman. I wasn't sure if I should start the fire or—" "Call me Ezra," the farmer said with a smile. "And yes, if you're of a mind to help, the fire would be appreciated. I'll see about breakfast." As they worked together, preparing their simple meal of biscuits and coffee, Ezra outlined his plans for the day. "First, we'll go into town and see about getting you some decent clothes. Then we'll stop by the schoolhouse and talk to Miss Patterson about your education. After that, we'll visit the church. Reverend Matthews should know you'll be staying with me." Tommy's stomach clenched with anxiety. "Do we have to go back to town so soon? Folks there? They might not be too happy to see me." Ezra placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Son, running from yesterday's mistakes won't help you build a better tomorrow. Besides, you've got nothing to be ashamed of. Hunger isn't a crime, and anyone with sense knows it." The ride into town was quiet. Tommy sitting beside Ezra on the wagon seat, watching the familiar buildings grow larger as they approached. He noticed how people stopped their conversations to stare as they passed, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disapproval. Their first stop was Morrison's General Store, where Silas Morton greeted them with obvious reluctance. "Ezra, boy." Morton's greeting was curt, his eyes never leaving Tommy's face. "Morning, Silas. Need to outfit Tommy here with some proper clothes. Growing boy needs sturdy fabric that'll hold up to farm work." Morton's expression softened slightly at the mention of payment. "Well, I suppose. Got some work shirts and trousers that might fit. Boots too, if his feet ain't too big." As they selected clothing, Tommy marveled at Ezra's quiet dignity. The farmer treated him not as a charity case or a burden, but as family, asking his preferences, ensuring proper fit, even splurging on a warm coat despite the obvious strain on his limited resources. At the schoolhouse, Miss Patterson, a spinster in her 30s with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake, welcomed Tommy warmly after Ezra explained the situation. "I remember you from before, Tommy," she said kindly. "You were a bright student when you attended regularly. We'll get you caught up in no time." The final stop was the small wooden church that served Redemption Creek's spiritual needs. Reverend Matthews, a tall man with premature grey hair and gentle eyes, listened as Ezra explained Tommy's circumstances. "The boy's had a hard time of it, Reverend. Lost his mother, been living rough. Figured the Christian thing was to offer him a home." Reverend Matthews nodded approvingly. "The good book says, 'Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress.' You're doing the Lord's work, Ezra." As they prepared to leave the church, Tommy tugged at Ezra's sleeve. "Why are you being so good to me? I mean, really? You barely know me." Ezra looked down at the boy, seeing his own lost children in Tommy's earnest face. "Sometimes, son, we help others not because of who they are, but because of who we're called to be. Sarah used to say that mercy given freely comes back tenfold. Guess we'll find out if she was right." Neither of them noticed the small crowd of strangers who had been quietly watching their interactions throughout the day. nor did they see these same strangers gathering near the church as evening approached, their faces filled with something that looked remarkably like reverence. Dawn broke over Redemption Creek with an unusual stillness, as if the very air was holding its breath. Ezra woke to the sound of voices, not the familiar morning calls of neighbors tending their animals, but something different, hushed, reverent tones that seemed to drift from the direction of town. He dressed quietly, not wanting to wake Tommy, and stepped onto his front porch. What he saw made him rub his eyes in disbelief. The road that led from his farm to town was filled with people, dozens of them, walking purposefully toward Redemption Creek. But these weren't townspeople. These were strangers, men in trail-worn clothes, women carrying bundles and leading children, elderly folks leaning on walking sticks, all moving with the same determined, almost pilgrimage-like purpose. Some carried small packs, others nothing but the clothes on their backs. They walked in small groups, speaking in low voices, occasionally glancing toward Ezra's farmhouse with expressions of profound respect. "Mr. Ezra?" Tommy's voice came from behind him, still thick with sleep. "What's all the commotion?" Ezra shook his head slowly. "I honestly don't know, son, but it appears we've got company coming to town." They watched as the stream of strangers continued, easily numbering in the hundreds by mid-morning. Among them, Ezra recognized a few faces from his past. Miguel Santos, a Mexican ranch hand he'd known years ago. Sarah Crow Feather, a Kiowa woman who sometimes traded in town. Even old Jacob Mueller, a German immigrant who'd moved west 5 years earlier. "Maybe we should head into town," Ezra suggested. "See what this is all about." The ride into Redemption Creek was surreal. The usually quiet main street was packed with people, but there was none of the chaos one might expect from such a crowd. Instead, an almost cathedral-like quiet pervaded the scene. Strangers sat on storefronts, gathered in small circles, or simply stood watching the church at the end of the street. Sheriff Coleman approached their wagon, his face a mask of bewilderment and concern. "Ezra, thank God you're here. Maybe you can make sense of this. These folks started arriving before sunrise. Must be 300 of them by now, maybe more." "What do they want?" Ezra asked, helping Tommy down from the wagon. "That's just it. They ain't asking for nothing. They're just here, waiting. A few of them asked about you specifically, wanted to know if you were the farmer who saved the boy. When I said yes, they just nodded and went back to waiting." Dr. Foster appeared at Ezra's elbow, her medical bag in hand, and her face flushed with excitement. "Ezra, you need to hear this. I've been talking to some of these people. They've come from all over, some from as far as New Mexico and Kansas. They all heard the same story." "What story?" Tommy asked, though something in his expression suggested he was beginning to understand. "The story of yesterday," Dr. Foster explained. "How a farmer stepped forward to save a boy from hanging, paid his debt, and took him in. But here's the remarkable part. They're telling it like it was some kind of miracle, like it was a sign." Ezra frowned. "A sign of what?" Before Dr. Foster could answer, Miguel Santos approached them. The weathered ranch hand removed his hat respectfully, his dark eyes bright with emotion. "Senor Whitman," he said in accented English, "I heard what you did yesterday. My grandson, he is the same age as this boy. When I heard how you saved him," Miguel's voice broke slightly, "it reminded me that there is still goodness in this world. Miguel, you rode all the way from—" "3 days, senor. But I had to come, had to see the man who chose mercy over justice. In my village we have been losing hope. The drought, the hard times. People forget how to be kind. But your story, it traveled like wildfire. It reminded us who we used to be." As Miguel walked away, Sarah Crow Feather approached. The Kiowa woman was elderly, her face lined with years of wisdom and sorrow. She looked directly at Tommy, then at Ezra. "The spirits spoke of this day," she said simply. "They said a white man would show the heart of the Great Spirit by saving one of his children. They said many would come to witness this thing." More people approached throughout the morning, each with a similar story. They had heard about Ezra's act of mercy through an informal network of travelers, traders, and drifters that stretched across the frontier. The story had grown in the telling, not with exaggeration, but with meaning. To these hard-pressed people, living through one of the harshest winters in memory, Ezra's simple act of kindness had become something larger, proof that compassion could still exist in a cruel world. Mayor Hutchins bustled up to them, sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. "Ezra, you've got to do something about this crowd. They're disrupting commerce, taking up space." "Some of the merchants are complaining." "Complaining about what?" interrupted Jeremiah Bass, the baker who had demanded Tommy's execution just the day before. To everyone's surprise, Bass's usual harsh expression had been replaced by something approaching shame. "These folks ain't causing trouble, they're just here." Bass turned to Ezra directly. "I've been thinking about yesterday, about what you did, about what I almost did." He swallowed hard. "I was so caught up in my anger, in protecting what little I had that I almost, God help me, I almost helped kill a child over a loaf of bread." The baker's words hung in the air like a confession. Around them, the crowd of strangers continued their quiet vigil, many now gathering near the church where Reverend Matthews had begun ringing the bells, not in alarm, but in welcome. "They want to attend service," Dr. Foster reported, returning from another conversation with the visitors. "All of them. They want to pray in the same church where the man who showed mercy worships." Tommy looked up at Ezra with wide eyes. "Is this really all because of what you did for me?" Ezra shook his head slowly. "No, son. This is because of what we all forgot, and what these folks came here to remember. Sometimes it takes one small act to remind people of who they're supposed to be." As if summoned by his words, Reverend Matthews appeared beside them. The minister's face was radiant with an emotion somewhere between joy and awe. "Ezra," he said softly, "I've been a preacher for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. These people, they're not here for spectacle or curiosity. They're here for hope. They're here because your act of mercy reminded them that God hasn't abandoned this world." The church bells continued to ring as the crowd began moving slowly toward the small wooden building. But even Ezra, in his humble wisdom, couldn't have predicted what they would find when those church doors opened, or how this simple act of gathering would reveal the true miracle that had begun with a boy's life saved and a farmer's mercy freely given. The greatest surprise was yet to come. The small wooden church of Redemption Creek had never held more than 50 people at one time. Built to serve a modest frontier community, its wooden pews and simple altar reflected the practical faith of hard-working people. But as Reverend Matthews opened the doors that Sunday morning, he faced an impossible sight. Nearly 400 souls seeking entrance to a building that could accommodate less than a tenth of their number. Yet something extraordinary happened. Instead of pushing or crowding, the gathered multitude organized themselves with quiet dignity. The elderly and families with small children were ushered inside first. Others knelt on the ground outside the church, creating concentric circles that stretched across the town square. Some sat on storefronts, others stood bareheaded in the cool morning air, but all faced the little church with expressions of profound reverence. Ezra found himself seated in the front pew, Tommy beside him, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what their simple act had inspired. As Reverend Matthews prepared to speak, the congregation, both inside and out, fell into a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying through the open doors and windows to reach every soul present, "we gather today not just as a community, but as witnesses to the power of mercy. Yesterday, one man chose compassion over judgment. Today, hundreds have come to remember what that choice means." From somewhere in the crowd outside, an elderly voice called out, "Tell us about the farmer." Reverend Matthews smiled gently. "The farmer sits among us. Ezra Whitman, would you stand?" Ezra rose reluctantly, his face flushed with embarrassment. A murmur of approval rippled through the assembled crowd, but he quickly gestured for them to be seated. "I don't deserve this attention," Ezra said simply. "I just did what any Christian man should do when faced with a hungry child." "That's exactly the point," called out Dr. Foster from her seat. "In our hardship, we forgot what we should do. We let fear make us cruel. You reminded us of who we're supposed to be." Sarah Crow Feather rose from her place in the circle outside. Her voice, though aged, carried clearly in the morning air. "Among my people we have a saying, when one person shows the courage to be kind, the spirits of kindness awaken in all hearts. This is what has happened here." Miguel Santos stood next. "In my village we were becoming like wolves, suspicious, hungry, thinking only of ourselves. But your story traveled to us, and it reminded us that we are not wolves. We are humans, made to care for each other. One by one, people began to stand and share their stories. A widow from New Mexico told how she had been ready to turn away a starving family until she heard about Ezra's mercy. A former Confederate soldier spoke of laying down his hatred when he learned that compassion knew no boundaries. A young mother from Kansas described how the story had inspired her community to open their doors to travelers and strangers. But it was Tommy who provided the most powerful testimony. The boy stood on his pew, his young voice clear and strong. 3 days ago, I was ready to die, he said. I had given up on everything, on people, on God, on myself. I thought the world was just a cruel place where the strong took from the weak, and nobody cared about anybody else. His voice trembled but didn't break. Mr. Ezra didn't just save my life, he saved my faith. He showed me that even when everything seems dark, there are people who choose light. The crowd listened in absolute silence as Tommy continued. All of you came here because his kindness reminded you of something you thought was lost. But I want you to know, you reminded me of something too. You reminded me that I matter, that my life has value, that maybe, just maybe, I can grow up to be the kind of man who helps others the way Mr. Ezra helped me. As Tommy sat down, something remarkable began to happen. People started moving, not away from the church, but toward each other. Strangers embraced. Old grievances were quietly forgiven. The Mexican ranch hands shared their meager food with former Confederate soldiers. Native Americans and white settlers sat side by side, speaking in quiet, respectful tones. Jeremiah Bass, the baker who had demanded Tommy's execution, stood with tears streaming down his face. I have a confession to make, he announced. For the past year, I've been angry. Angry at the drought, angry at my losses, angry at anyone who seemed to have what I didn't. That anger nearly made me complicit in the murder of a child. He turned to Tommy directly. Son, I owe you an apology. And I owe this community a promise that I'll never let fear make me cruel again. Mayor Hutchins, visibly moved by the proceedings, stood as well. I propose we make this day an annual observance in Redemption Creek. A day when we remember that mercy is stronger than judgment, that kindness is more powerful than fear. But the most surprising moment came when Sheriff Coleman approached the front of the church. Folks, I got something to say about justice. For too long we've confused justice with vengeance. Real justice, the kind that builds communities instead of tearing them down, looks a lot more like what Ezra did yesterday than what we almost did to Tommy. The sheriff reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross. My grandmother gave me this when I first pinned on this badge. She said it was to remind me that my job wasn't to punish people, but to protect the innocent and help the guilty find their way back to righteousness. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. He handed the cross to Tommy. I want you to have this, son, and I want you to remember that you've got a whole community watching out for you now. As the informal service continued, donations began appearing. Not just money, but offers of work, food, clothing, and shelter for anyone in need. The widow Jenkins offered to teach school to children whose families couldn't afford formal education. The German immigrants shared seeds for drought-resistant crops. The Kiowa offered to show the farmers water-finding techniques their ancestors had used for centuries. By afternoon, what had begun as a simple church service had transformed into something unprecedented, a community of mutual aid that crossed every boundary of race, religion, and background that had previously divided them. As the sun began to set, Ezra and Tommy stood on the steps of the church, watching as the visitors prepared to return to their homes. But they weren't leaving empty-handed. They carried with them renewed faith, practical assistance, and most importantly, the memory of what a community could become when it chose mercy over judgment. Mr. Ezra, Tommy said quietly, do you really think this will last? Will people remember when times get hard again? Ezra placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, looking out at the departing crowd. Son, I've learned something today. Kindness isn't just something you do, it's something you become. And once enough people become kind, it changes everything. As they walked home together, the church bells of Redemption Creek rang out across the prairie one final time, carrying the message far and wide that mercy had triumphed, hope had been restored, and a small town had remembered what it meant to be truly human. In the months that followed, Redemption Creek became known throughout the territory not for its harsh justice, but for its radical compassion. Travelers sought it out not just for supplies, but for the hope that they might find the same mercy that had transformed a condemned boy into a beloved son, and a struggling community into a beacon of redemption. And Tommy O'Brien grew up to become exactly the kind of man his adoptive father had shown him he could be, one who chose mercy over judgment, one small act of kindness at a time.